Hello, and welcome to What the Denmark, the show that explains things that seem peculiar as an outsider in Denmark. I'm Sam.
And I'm Josefine. Each episode will discuss a new topic, talk to experts, and try to understand why something so normal in Denmark is confusing to foreigners. Despite living abroad for many years, I'll be giving the inside view of Danish culture.
And as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm originally from the UK, and so we'll be giving the outsider view of the country. Our ultimate goal is to resolve cultural confusion in Denmark. This show is just one part of that mission, and so stick around to the end to hear about how you too can be involved.
It's been a really exciting ride until now doing What the Denmark, don't you think?
I mean, when I think back to when we first met and we started doing the first recording on duvets,
Yeah.
it feels like so much has happened. I remember it was in the throes of the first corona wave because there was a bit of a, when we could go in the studio. Yeah, so at the last minute we had to change. But it must have been back in June or something.
Yeah, was it in Frederiksberg? Well, it was some sort of backyard room.
Backyard room, yeah. And it was just quite early on when we'd met each other. And I was just like, oh yeah, just come to this back alley into this weird little room. But you brought backup. You came with your friend Martin.
Yeah. I brought my lovely colleague Martin Ramsgaard, and he's done a lot of both radio and TV. So he had some good input, actually.
What I liked about that episode was we spoke to so many people in doing this duvets one. There were people in America, people from Canada. There was a Danish person. There was going to Jysk. There was so many little clips that we did for that one.
Yeah, the duvet was a lot of fun, and I think it had quite a lot of laughter in it because it's something that resonated with people in a sort of slightly humorous way about the way we engage as a couple and, you know, the way that we react to hotel rooms, to our spaces at home.
And it's one where lots of people have sort of got in touch, and lots of Danish, non-Danish couples, they've had a chat. And they're like, okay, we need to talk about the duvet situation because one of them will just been using the double duvet. And then suddenly the Dane is like, hold on a second, maybe we should do separate duvets. And it's caused I think there have been lots of conversations between couples around Denmark as a result of that episode where they've really sort of thought, which one should we do?
And then we also managed to dive into the history of the duvet, which was interesting.
The idea of a duvet is a relatively recent phenomenon in the UK. So there was apparently a guy called Sir Terence Conran who owned a range of stores called Habitat. And the story goes, I don't know how true this actually is that in the 1960s he found himself in Stockholm, waking up in bed with, he says, a lovely Swedish lady, and there was this big fluffy blanket on the bed. And she was like, well, this is a duvet. And he thought, well, this thing's great. When he went back to West London, that was the first thing he started doing in his shop on King's Road. Apparently that's what introduced British culture into duvets. It's crazy, isn't it? How so many of these things you just take for granted. But the idea of a big, fluffy, comfy duvet, 50, 60 years ago, that was an innovation in England.
Yeah, because you used to have those blankets. Remember, I was mentioning that as well, with a sheet under, and you never knew how often they'd be cleaned. So sleeping under these blankets with this sheet and waking up in the middle of the night and finding that you might be chewing on this blanket was rather unpleasant.
Not a great experience, yeah. So I can see this is a really good export that Denmark/Scandinavia have done for the world, is to bring this big fluffy duvet.
Where you have a sheet around it that can be cleaned every time someone has slept in it.
Genius. Absolute genius.
Do you chew in your sleep a lot?
Obviously on the blankets if they're there.
Okay.
No, but have you ever tried that, Andreas? Andreas is our sound expert, our podcast expert, and he sits here next to us while we do the show. But now I'm actually wondering whether you're too young to have ever experienced England in the old days where you had sheets with a blanket on top, and that was instead of a duvet.
I have experienced sheets before, in hotels. Not in England, probably, but it's a terrible feeling when you go to a country, especially hot countries, and you just have these sheets. I don't know what to do with them, and maybe a blanket on top.
Yes. Tucked in underneath the mattress.
And you're really squeezed in.
Yeah.
It's almost like an envelope, isn't it? Where you've got to like slot yourself in, and then you feel like you're in some sort of like medical brace, or like you're in an asylum where you can't like move.
Are you actually supposed to just slide under like that?
I feel like you must surely just like get it all out and then just flap it about a bit and then get in to give yourself some space.
Yeah. Do you know how you swaddle a baby and then, they feel really comfortable? But actually, it's a bit like being swaddled as an adult. You can't move.
Yeah.
Some people might love it. Sam, do you like it?
Well, I think that the big thing which I found, especially with the duvets one, is lots of my English friends have got in touch and were like, yeah, really enjoyed that duvet episode.
Yeah.
What do you guys do? I'm a separate duvet convert. Part of the motivation for making this episode was so I could give some context to my friends so that they know that I still love my girlfriend. Because to an English person or someone who's never seen separate duvets, the immediate association is you're sleeping in separate beds, therefore you don't love each other. And so it's like really important to explain it is possible to have separate duvets on the same bed. You still love each other, but you just have separate duvets.
It was just a way to kind of tell your friends without having the conversation.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very English. Very English. You don't want to say it. Not bold enough to sort of avoiding conflict.
Avoid conflict. Just make a podcast episode. That's the simplest
In fact,
way
that's
of doing
why
it.
you made What the Denmark. Full stop. It was basically to explain you still love your girlfriend.
Exactly.
Well, that's a compliment.
Yes.
But what we also found out was about sleep disturbance. Apparently, when you sleep with separate duvets, you're supposedly sleeping better because sharing often wakes people up.
Yeah, and it's a way to avoid the duvet wars. I'm not sure if that's the medical or the scientific term, but this idea of a lot of your sleep disturbance is caused by your partner. And so having a separate duvet is sort of the superior way. It just seems to boil down to the sleep quality versus the intimacy. And I think the big learning for me was separate duvets can still be intimate and you also get the sleep quality. Whereas a lot of people who have never heard of it before, it's like, will you sleep well individually or are you going to effectively be in separate beds? And, I'll compromise on the sleep quality because that shows that I love my partner. Whereas actually, I think it's possible to retain the intimacy and still get a good night's sleep.
And the other option is the one I've chosen, which is basically get a massive, absolutely massive. I think I have an X-large king-size double duvet. And so it's a nightmare changing the sheets because you have to sort of figure out where the corners have to go and so on. But actually, we sleep really well under that. And you can snuggle up together and watch a film or be cozy, hyggelig in different ways. But obviously, now there are more options for everyone out there. And they don't have to feel that they can't have a romance and a loving relationship having a single duvet.
The one thing we weren't able to do an interview with, and I guess it's potentially a bit of I don't know if it's a sensitive topic, but I'm really curious as to like people who are dating and let's say that you invite someone back to your house for the first time. And if you're single and you've got a double bed, you probably just have one single duvet on there because that's where you sleep. But if like someone comes back and they notice there's a second duvet, are they like, oh, are you expecting me to stay? Or something, or that might be like a slightly.
How hopeful are you before you go out that night? Should there be two duvets on the bed or just one?
Yeah, so I'd love to hear from any people who are in the dating game in Denmark and whether this is what they've done.
Maybe Andreas has a few. Andreas, let me just turn the microphone your way. Are you in the dating game?
Sam keeps looking while saying this, and I am single, but I'm not in the dating game now. But I know people will keep a second duvet just somewhere. Yeah. I have a blanket.
Just in case they bring some lady home or
man. If they have like a guest or so, it's just for guests, right? So, but guests can be anything.
So you have it ready in the cupboard to pull it out in case you don't want the accompanying person to be cold all night.
Yeah.
After the romance. I would say just buy a double duvet. Then no one can ask questions.
Honestly, so much nuance in this duvet situation. It's something you rarely think about, but there's so much to it.
And I think that it surprised a lot of Danes, this duvet situation, because they've always taken for granted that everyone sleeps with each their duvet.
Yeah.
And a lot of people actually commented on it after the episode, particularly Danes. I heard from from internationals that they were like, yes, someone who finally understands how odd it is. And then we heard from Danes like, well, what's the issue? I mean, it's normal to sleep with a single duvet, but maybe it's not.
One of the things I've quite enjoyed over the last few weeks, Josefine, is reading through some of the lovely reviews that we've had on the podcast. And I think that what's been interesting is that from reading them and from talking to people, we're sort of getting a better understanding of who's listening to the show. So I'm just going to read some here. So first of all, thank you to Marianne JC. Her review is awesome. The topics are interesting. I especially enjoyed the episode on making friends, the ideas and interviews. Can't wait to learn more about Denmark. It's quite nice.
There was a really lovely one from a Dane, I imagine, with that name, called Thomas Christensen, who says, very well produced, and then saying, I'm only one episode in, but as a Dane, I'm shocked about how many aha moments I get that explains all these things that I thought was just normal. Did you know that Danes are the very hardest in the world to make friends with?
It's great, isn't it?
Yeah,
Just
it
like
really is great. It's really great. And, we obviously had 2 episodes on friendship.
I mean, it was such a big topic. And actually, in there, we referenced this organization, Internations, which is essentially a global community of expats. And they have operations in 60 different countries. And each year they do their expat review, where they do a big survey and they say, what they sort of rank the different countries based on how easy it is to get a job, or how safe do you feel, or what's it like to raise kids, and what's it like to feel welcome or to make friends. And once again, Denmark came basically at the bottom of that list of all the countries surveyed in terms of, as expats, how easy is it to feel welcome and to make friends.
A lot of people actually wrote to us following that episode and said how much it resonated with them. And it's both people who grew up in Denmark maybe 30 years ago that we heard from, and then it's people who are here now. So obviously it's not a new problem that that people struggle to break into Danish culture and society.
Yeah, and I think a big thing that we've been quite conscious about in doing this is to make sure that we don't just end up being like some sort of shouting match, where often, I don't know, sometimes go on Facebook and I sort of see these quotes and comments, and it sort of quite easily goes down into, oh, it's so difficult. And then Danes are like, oh, no, it's not actually that bad if you make an effort or whatever. And I think, especially when it comes to the friends thing, it's like it is a complex topic, that there is quite a lot of nuance involved. And of course, some people find it easy to make friends. Some people find it difficult. But I think what I quite like about what we were able to do was to sort of put some theory around what's going on in Denmark. So, for example, you had some great points about the expectation that you maintain friends from school and family relations because the country is quite small. And so you don't necessarily have as much space for new friends because you're retaining these old friendships compared to, for example, when I went to university in the UK, I was like 4 hours away. And so I made my university friends were very separate from my home friends. And so it was easy for me to sort of add these new friendships as opposed to maintaining existing ones. And so I think, yeah, having that sort of framework is like, okay, obviously still some people find it easier and some people find it difficult, but it gives a bit more context to it.
Yeah, and you were also mentioning already from early childhood, you were in different classes at school, and you mixed with many different children. So you had to learn to relate to them and befriend many different children from the very start. Whereas in Danish schools, we are with the same group of children for the first 10 years. And that makes a big difference. So it becomes like a very close-knit group and like a family. And in addition to that, you have your family obligation to actually participate in all the socials through that. And being a very small country in Denmark, we actually always expect people to make the effort of going to each family party. Because, I mean, even if you're in one corner and the family lives in the other corner of Denmark, it might be a 5-hour drive. It's such a small country.
I think one thing as well is this idea of like socializing in small groups and sort of maintaining or creating these deep, meaningful relationships where there is this sort of loneliness epidemic, as they call it, where, lots of people don't feel they have connections to people. And I don't know what the stats are in Denmark, but I imagine part of the reason why Denmark is, quote unquote, the happiest country in the world is because there are these deep, meaningful relationships that you can rely on others. And that comes from investing in these relationships and friendships. And so that can often feel like it comes at the expense of having space for new people. What I hope we've shown in that episode or those episodes is there can be space for other people in your life who aren't really, really, really close friends.
And what we also discussed was how to go about it, how to break into Danish society. And I think I mentioned in the episode that a good way to do so is by potentially having a wine tasting. And I have been invited to a lot of wine tasting since then by the international community, which is lovely. I've already been to a couple. And obviously the way it is in Denmark is that you sort of take turns and inviting each other.
Yeah.
So it's now my turn to have quite a lot of wine tastings. So, but yes, it works.
An interesting thing with the whole episode, because there was the two interviewees,
Emilia and Camilla.
Yeah. So they were talking about just seeing each other for small things, just taking a little walk.
Yeah, being spontaneous.
Yeah, instead of these whole events almost, they were talking about like a big thing. And I talked to my friends a few weeks ago, and we were talking about like some of my really good friends that I see regularly. And we were talking about how it was funny that we almost never hang out, just like one-on-one. It's always the group. And then I just said, well, I don't know what I would do if I was hanging out with you, like one of my really good friends. I don't know what we would do if we were just hanging out. It's like, yeah, I feel the same. So that's why we don't actually meet up and just like one-on-one. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
That it's just so ingrained that you only meet at events. And it's like the whole group, and there's something to do instead of just being, hey, want to hang out for a few hours and basically do nothing.
Yeah.
But we don't do that. I think it was pretty interesting, actually.
Yeah, it's very much based around groups. And that's also the other thing about we don't tend to invite other people into the groups that we have created because they're quite close-knit groups. Whereas abroad, or in many other countries across the world, you would have bigger parties and everyone would be invited along. And obviously, because of the weather, you would have more space if you're in the garden, for example, or outside meeting for a picnic instead of being in your home.
And it's in those sorts of environments, it's very much more is more. Like the more people who come, the more potential conversations, the more people you can meet, etc. And it really sort of makes sense. Whereas when it's 4 people in the middle of winter having dinner in an apartment, there might not be space for 2 more, but also if you add those extra people, it might dilute the cozy feeling that you have. And therefore it's very much, okay, well, we won't add extra people to it. As a result of the episode, I have, however, tried to make a more of a conscious effort to
be more spontaneous?
Spontaneous, but also speak with friends and try and like create spaces where it's not weird to bring people along. And so there's like a few friends where I've known them separately, and I was like, okay, do you know what? Let's just the 4 of us meet up for a beer, and it was great, and we could all like have a nice chat, even though I sort of knew each of them individually. The fact that they could sort of all come together and we had this sort of roughly common interest was it was nice, but it only came about as a conscious decision of, oh, actually, I should do this.
Yeah, and it's like, if you're 4 people, I'd say it's like 4 birds with 1 stone, isn't it? And it just means that you can also create more space for more people in your life. So I think that was the interesting thing about the friendship episode, that we dived into why it is difficult to make friends in Denmark and why Denmark might not be the most hospitable of people. And it's not because they don't want to. I think they're just not really aware that they're so difficult to approach. And we also talked about the work sphere versus the private sphere, that it's very separate, not very connected. So it's very difficult to meet someone at work and then also be good colleagues and then be invited back into people's space. So, but there are ways to do it. And I thought it was really interesting because the reactions out in the real world after the podcast, we saw, for example, a Canadian lady who works at Vestas, Lawrence Paquette. She basically wrote an open letter about friendships after she'd listened to the podcast episode, where she talked about, how she'd gone about it. because she'd managed to break into Danish society, and she wanted to tell her friends and the international community, this is how I went about it. And, that's felt fantastic to see that actually it had that impact. And it meant that we provided people with some knowledge as to how to approach it.
I've been recently spending a bit of time on Facebook, just sort of, going through and reading some of the expat groups, etc. And I mean, there really are some pretty heartbreaking stories on there of people who have sort of come with really high hopes, ambitions of coming to Denmark, and they just they're trying everything. They're going to networking events, they're trying to sort of volunteer, they're doing all these things, but they just can't do it, and they just can't find they've got like a connection or the friends here, and then they sort of end up having to go home, and it's really heartbreaking. If you take a fishing analogy, bear with me on this, if you're going fishing for friends
fishing, I love it.
friend fishing, like go to a place where you're more likely to find people who you're connecting with. So just walking up to a random Danish person on the street, it's a bit hit and miss as to whether you'll be friends. But if you're both choosing to spend your time after work going to a think tank event about whatever, then chances are you've got some common interests.
Correct.
And that way you're sort of most of the way there. Which is why I think often, well, at least when I was in East Africa for a few years, most expats that you'd meet, there's a good chance you'd get on because these are people who have decided to spend their 20s in Kenya. And so you've already got a pretty similar worldview and way in which you're doing things.
And I think the example that you had with Camilla and Emilia, they also had some common interests that meant that they befriended each other and were very natural with each other, though one was Brazilian and the other one was Danish. So I think definitely if you find people through your hobbies, that is certainly a good way. I love the analogy that we used in the friendship episode with the coconut friendship versus a peach, where the coconut friendship is the Danish one because, it's hard on the outside and it's soft on the inside. So once you're in, you're in. Whereas with the Americans, it's the peach. So it's very easy to chat to people, but you don't really reach the core. That's hard.
I think there's an interesting dynamic as well, though, because in Canada and Australia, people would very easily start chatting to you. But then how I make friendships is like the more Danish thing. So it's like, oh, we're friends now and we can talk about everything.
I imagine, how do they react? Like, because it might have been, in a way, quite refreshing to have someone who's like, oh my gosh, this person actually cares about me.
They did like it. They were just very open to it, too. Some people were actually surprised when you chatted to them a few times and then you see them again and you ask them about, oh, how was this? And something more personal about their life. And they might remember you and they might meet somebody else in exchange. And they were like, oh, do you know Andreas? One of my friends told me.
Yeah.
Because we had chatted like twice or something. And then they felt there was more of a connection maybe. Seemed more interested in them. I'm not sure, but it's a funny dynamic.
But that's a beauty of traveling, isn't it? And experiencing new cultures. Basically, that whole idea that the way you react with each other and how you learn about the way your culture works in comparison to others. So, there might have been that shell, but the fact that you could actually go deep in and you really deeply, you cared so much about people that you actually asked questions about what they'd been up to and you remembered, that meant something to them.
Because they would be very keen on making contact and talking. And then I'm like, oh, they're interested, right? Yeah. They want to be my friend. And then I'm like, we're friends now.
And so you went wholeheartedly into it. Your like, coconut shell had been broken.
Yeah, it was like, okay, great. If they want to make contact, if somebody talks to me in a coffee shop or something in Denmark, they really want to be my friend. So I made friends with all the baristas and everything, and we were like hanging out, and I was getting free coffees and stuff like that.
Asked, how's your mom doing?
Like
how's so and so? Yeah,
talking about everything. I was like hanging out with them after work sometimes. Yeah, it was great.
So because of a slightly cultural misunderstanding, Andreas now has a ton of friends in Canada and the US. I love it.
I love how these people in Canada and the US will be like, oh my God, Danes are so friendly.
Yeah.
And this is like the complete opposite. So when you get here.
Because they were just service-minded by, asking nice questions and small talking potentially. Yeah. But Andreas, he was not used to that from Denmark. So he thought that this was a friendship common. That gets me thinking about the flat hierarchies episode that we did, which actually has resonated with people in the States. Now we're talking about the US.
I was about to say, well, this has been one of the big lessons or interesting things, I think, from this first season, which is when we started, there's clearly like a lot of non-Danes, international people in Denmark, like myself, who are a bit confused about Danish culture and want to understand what's going on. And so we were like, okay, episodes that we'll be making about how to get a job or how to make friends in Denmark, these are going to be really relevant for internationals in Denmark. And then we thought, actually, okay, in order to make this good, we're going to do it in a way where it involves Danish people. And so Danish people can be like, oh, actually, here's an interesting theory about how to make friendships. Oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. This is sort of going to be useful. What we didn't bank on is international people who don't live in Denmark, but are curious to learn from Denmark and like what Denmark can teach the world. And so if we look at the stats, flat hierarchies, far and away the most listened to. But if you drill down into the location of where this is, only like 25% of the listens are in Denmark. Most of them are in the US and the UK.
Yeah, so it's really fascinating because they're obviously interested in the Nordic management style and the trust-based management style that we have, where basically everyone can speak in meetings. In fact, are expected to talk in meetings, even juniors. And that's not so usual there.
It isn't. And it's this sense of like, yeah, what can we learn from Denmark? And I think we're probably going to make more episodes on things that Denmark can teach the world, because it seems like there's a real appetite for the Danish way of doing things. Your anecdote about the house help in South Africa really resonated with me and a lot of people who have also been listening. This idea of you have a house help who comes and does the cleaning and the washing up, etc., when you're living in South Africa, and rather than get a uniform, which kind of really sort of signals them out as this is the cleaner, you're like, well, let me just get you some clothes so you can like
some
be like
comfortable clothes.
Yeah. And you were saying how she was like, no, I want this uniform because it shows that I'm a working person and like this is my job and I take pride in that job. And the fact that really has this sort of separation between employer and employee, I can really feel how that would feel uncomfortable.
Most Danes would feel quite uncomfortable with uniforms generally. We don't have uniforms in schools either. And it's interesting because in many countries you'd see uniforms as an equalizer because we all look the same. But it goes against all Danish sense of equalitarianism. It's basic, and also the sense of independence, because we do like people to be independent thinkers and to pick their own clothes and to do what they want to do. But the uniforms, no, the Danes don't understand them. I understand them because my kids have been in them in South Africa. But it's very difficult to understand for Danes. But I think the thing about uniforms in Denmark as well is the fact that we don't like there to be a distinction between people. We like us all to seem equal. And actually, when it comes to education and children, we want the teachers to be equal to the children even. You also call them by first name.
Absolutely mental. I can't believe that must feel so disrespectful. Like, I'd find that so disrespectful.
And it's not. Yeah. We think it would be disrespectful to the rights of the children if they were not on an even level to the teacher. Yeah. And that is also why education is a really interesting topic that we must and will dive into.
I think we're going to have to do like a separate series just on
education.
On education. There's so much to go into.
And childhood in Denmark. Because again, now we're moving into the trust space. You know, children get to do a lot here in Denmark that you would never get away with abroad. I mean, I remember I have a good English friend of mine. The way he tried to explain it in a very diplomatic way, saying, yeah, the Scandinavians like to indulge their children. And basically that was a way of explaining that they swear a lot and they misbehave a lot in his eyes. But obviously it's just a different parenting style where we allow children to experiment more and we're more open to their views and opinions. But then we also hope that they learn to make sense of the world and behave sensibly quite early on, so they can cope alone and be independent in situations later in life. And that also means that most Danes are extremely independent very early on.
One thing which we didn't touch on, which I'd be interested if anyone listening has an opinion on, is basically how flat is the Danish army? Like the army in general is like a very hierarchical organization.
It's not flat. And I can say that because actually I was very briefly in the army as an intern. Yes, because I actually thought that could be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Little did I know how hierarchical it was. And it came as a real shock to me because, you know, when you've not been brought up with that, it's really annoying. Then someone will tell you what to do all the time and they won't ask your opinion.
So is there any element of Danishness, did you find? Obviously, you've not been in the army in other countries, but I mean, was there any element of collaboration or like, oh, we're going to go into battle, like, what do we all think? Or is
it? Nope, it was all
Really?
absent. I think that actually that is interesting, isn't it? Whether if you did a study on armies of different parts of the world, whether they would be very similar.
Yeah.
Because my experience, now it's quite a few years ago, of course, but my experience was it was 100% hierarchical. You did what the constable wanted you to do, and you were punished in a very, to a Danish person, unfair manner. So, for example, I remember we were out in November in the middle of the winter. Just imagine there was ice on the puddles and it was freezing cold. And I remember one of the guys forgot his one glove, and that basically meant that we all had to take off our gloves. And then someone said that they thought that was not a good idea because in the Danish manner, they objected. I mean, why would we do such a thing? And the punishment for this person was that he basically had to stand out and guard a place where we were sitting inside having hot chocolate. And for 2 hours without gloves, he was out there. And lots of us felt extremely uncomfortable with this poor being out there. But that's what you get for questioning the constable.
I don't think there's a lot of, you don't say sir and stuff like that, though.
Oh, really?
Is one thing I thought about.
Did you address people by their first names like you did in school?
No, you definitely called them by their surname. Yeah, I remember our Constable Fessel.
Yeah.
He was not a nice dude. He was not. I remember he was also like, it felt like bullying to me, basically, because I had blonde hair, looked like a normal Dane. And I had long hair as well. And then he thought that could be seen from the airspace. And that was obviously a danger to the whole group. So one of the first exercises was that we had to break the puddle so that we could get the mud out and smear that into my hair so that I couldn't be seen from airspace.
Oh, my God.
That was cold. That was very unpleasant.
Oh, my God.
And, there was no questioning that.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. I mean, but...
Yeah. And you say you left the army, did you? After a while,
I decided that was not for me.
Not quite for you.
More or less immediately.
Well, I think this is often what, going full circle back to the flat hierarchies, when we spoke about both the positives and the negatives, for a lot of people who are used to, here's what you do, here are the parameters, and then coming to Denmark and you're like, oh my God, this is actually not very nice because I've got to figure everything out. And so everyone talks about, flat hierarchies, they're so great. They're not great for everyone. Like if people are used to a bit of structure and being able to sort of get on with what they need to do, it can actually be quite stressful.
Yeah, it can be terrifying if you're thrown into the deep end like that. But I think what most Danes know is it's okay to ask questions and to ask for help. And and if you're not from a culture where you're used to that and that is a sign of weakness, then you feel very lonely. But most Danes don't because they know that they can ping-pong ideas with their colleagues without seeming weak or stupid.
And with their boss.
And with their boss, they can ask. And in fact, the boss expects you to say that if you're struggling or if you need sparring, as we call it, if you need to brainstorm ideas with them, they're available for that. So, and also people expect you to be able to go out. You are trained to have the tools to go out and find out how to solve a problem if you have an issue. And so most people, they feel comfortable being able to do that, helped by their boss, if they don't have an answer.
I mean, that was to really sort of crystallize the sense of coming into a flat hierarchy. That's what really struck me. Was I'm used to being in an environment where you only go to your boss to tell them good things, or any sign of asking them a question is a sign of weakness, and therefore you're less likely to get a promotion or whatever. And so this idea of like showing a bit of vulnerability to your boss, that's the big thing that I've had to unlearn, is that having that relationship with the boss, as opposed to this is the person who's deciding how much I get a pay rise. I think that there were a couple of things that came out of the Getting a Job episodes. So one is that like just recognizing that there is this cultural difference, and how can non-Danes who are really well qualified just slightly adapt their application process to more fit into the Danish way. But I think the interesting thing is like looking at it from the other perspective, which is if you are a Danish company who is able to look past some of these cultural differences, there's suddenly a load of international talent in Denmark where if you just accept, okay, this person's saying I a bit more than they're saying we, then, okay, maybe that means they're not competent. But actually, if you can say, okay, well, this person's got some great international experience, we can definitely make space for them in the team. Suddenly you've got a really highly qualified person who's so grateful almost for a job here, that you're going to get a bit of a bargain, really.
And who's going to bring in a lot of experience.
Yeah.
And also the fact that you bring some diversity to a team means that you bring some new perspectives. So we could really benefit from getting some more internationals on the Danish labor market. And therefore, I found that it was great to make that episode because it opened up for some opportunities potentially for internationals, because the Danes listening will maybe understand better where they're coming from when they're applying for a job, and they might sound like they're bragging, but actually they could be a wonderful asset to the team.
Yeah.
And I remember Carrie-Anne. Remember her, this incredible woman with all the answers. Basically, she had a very strategic way of going about getting a job and applying for jobs.
Do your research on the company. Prove that that company is actually a company that you want to work for. If you don't do your research, you're not going to gain employment. And research is really in terms of finding a little bit out about the company and making sure that when you're sending an application, you're not sending a copy-paste. Hobbies and interests, you need to have that in there. That shows a personal aspect, personal side of who you are, and also, more importantly, what you do outside of work. Because if you all work, then at some point, you're potentially going to go down with stress, or you're going to feel overwhelmed, overworked, and going to pull other people down with you. It affects the group.
This is a big thing. Like, I was listening to it and I was like, this is so applicable, not just for Denmark.
What I thought was quite interesting about the Getting a Job episode, apart from the incredible advice from Carrie-Anne, was this idea that internationals should remember to put greater emphasis on their team achievements when they apply for a job. And then what Danish organizations could learn is basically when they are looking at the application from an international, don't expect it to sound like a Danish application. What might sound to you as bragging is probably just the way an application would be written abroad. So the internationals can learn to maybe focus on different kinds of achievements, and the Danes can learn to be more open-minded when they read people's applications.
Quick one, Andreas. Have you ever had any sort of interesting job application stories or things that you've found you've done when you've applied for a job?
Things that I've done when I applied for a job.
Or like, you know, if any sort of interesting anecdotes from when you've done job applications.
I mean, not a lot of stories, no, but I actually thought yesterday I talked to one of my dorm mates. I think she has dual citizenship. She's like Swedish and Saudi Arabian. But she asked me yesterday if you should send out a lot of applications, actually, if that was the best way to do it.
Ah, and you had the advice.
Yeah, and I told her, well, you should listen to our podcast.
So I know that we want to talk about Danish humour. If we think about sort of behind the scenes of What the Denmark, This was actually a different type of format, slightly different format, in that we had a researcher, Esker, who came in and he did the research and he basically presented to Josephine and I. So with a lot of the other episodes, I went off and like interviewed the head of the Danish Handball Federation or Kerry Ann. And so it was me and you having a chat. But in this time, Esker was the one who spoke to the experts. He came in, the three of us had a conversation. And it was really fun. I quite enjoyed that. So Esker, welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
So you've been doing some research on Danish humour.
I did, yeah. It was very interesting.
What was one of the things that surprised you most?
I think what's really interesting about it all is how entrenched Danish humor actually is in the way we are as a society.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, the way Danish people use humor is actually a quite good of a reflection of how we act, not just when we joke, but the way we meet people in general.
I also thought, Esker did a great job in being able to synthesize this big thing, Danish humour, and then actually sort of put some theory behind it. And I think the things which stood out were this sense of equality and needing to get people on the same level. And so humour is often used to kind of like put people down and get them on the same level.
Yeah, we dived into Janteloven, which is so important, and I'm sure that we'll do an episode just on that at some point. It's the law of Jante, which...
And just to jump, right, this is not like a written law. This is not like a law that's a law of the land.
No, it actually comes from the 1930s, and it's from a novel by an author called Axel Sandemos. So it's not a law, but it's a way we live.
The way it was, I heard it described was it's like an informal Scandinavian 10 Commandments.
Correct. And the first one is do not believe that you are anything. And that is the most important one. And I would say that that is relevant to all aspects of life in Denmark and in Scandinavia. And so now we've just talked about getting a job. It's all about the team. It's not about you. You shouldn't think you're anything. Humor, it's the same. We don't want bragging in Denmark, basically. And it's the same with friendships. People react very strongly to anyone talking too much about their own successes. It's about constantly equalizing yourself and being part of the group. Actually, it's interesting because we celebrate the individual as long as they don't celebrate themselves.
Celebrate? Okay, let me say it again. That felt like it's a really good point. I just need to say it again. So we celebrate the individual
as long as they don't celebrate themselves. Exactly. You can't celebrate yourself.
And they shouldn't celebrate themselves with the others celebrating them either.
Yeah.
They shouldn't say, when everybody says, "Oh, you're so great at this," they shouldn't be.
You don't say yes.
Yeah, maybe I am great at this. No. Don't do
yeah.
that.
You're just like, no, or you ignore it, or deadpan reaction is a good reaction too. Yeah. And that's very difficult to understand for many internationals because, for example, in the US, you celebrate achievements. I know it was the same in South Africa and the UK. You celebrate the clever students in the class. You celebrate when people are the very best. We would never do that in Denmark. It would be, it's about celebrating the group and it's about helping the weakest. Yeah. We have this social egalitarianism that literally runs through everything we do in society. Yeah.
Now, the social egalitarianism aspect, looking after the weak, etc., like, that might give you the impression that Danish humour is all like nicey-nicey. Oh, we want to make sure everyone feels happy, everyone feels cosy. But actually, Danish humour is brutal. And it's really like extreme. And so I think that was something where you've kind of got to sort of square off these two aspects of, it's quite, Danish people are quite reserved and they're quite ironic. But at the same time, they're saying these really like brutal and often offensive things.
Yeah, we're constantly testing our freedom of speech, and we do that through our humor, and that can feel very extreme to a politically correct international.
Yeah, I mean, I've got this is funny. In the notes for this, I wrote down a little thing next to my name, which was a retarded anecdote, and Josefine was like, "Oh my God, is this you, Sam?"
I thought the same.
I was like, I don't have a retarded anecdote for you. Maybe I do, but I'm not going to share it.
And this happened like last week, where a friend of mine, Thomas, he's got a blog where he talks about various things to do with work and whatnot. And then he said this thing in the blog post: you wouldn't choose to do that. It would be retarded to do that. And I read it and I was like, "Hi, Thomas, really liked the blog post, especially the closing sentence, blah, blah, blah." Quick thing. The phrase, "that person must be retarded," is, in my experience, quite a controversial / loaded word, especially in the US. Maybe you should soften it to say, "that person must be crazy. That person must be silly." And he was like, "Thanks, man, but I'm savage, as you know. What are you up to tonight? Do you fancy going for a beer?" And I was like, "I get it. It's just, to me, it reads a bit like you're making fun of people who are mentally handicapped. Obviously, it's your call and not what you mean by writing it, but I just wanted to let you know." And his response was, "You are so English, Sam. I will think of you next time I write recklessly."
Yeah, so it's nice that you actually gave that input. But I mean, in Denmark, we do like to push the boundaries because we're testing a whole lot of things all the time about our democracy, about our freedom of speech. And therefore, it can come across as very brute.
And I think in that situation, like the topic was something completely different. And he just had this phrase, "Oh my God, you'd be retarded to think that." And I was like,
but I think it's also about it's about his English, potentially.
Well, I mean, he's got very good English.
Yeah, but that's a problem with Danes. We have very good English, and therefore we also offend people because we don't use a filter when we translate the Danish vocabulary into English.
Yeah.
And that can cause a lot of cultural confusion, basically. Yeah. So also, you hear American films where people swear, they use the F word and various other nasty words. In Danish, we just use those. Kids use them.
Yeah.
And I mean, it can be, it feels very wrong to an international hearing children speak like that.
Yeah.
But, there's no filter, and that's a language problem. And then there's also that extra dimension, which is a cultural dimension of us constantly pushing and testing the boundaries because that's what we're brought up with in terms of freedom of speech. Now, we obviously can't redo the whole humor episode right now, but actually it's worth listening to it because one of the things that explains why Danes understand each other when we say outrageous things or when we are ironic is due to these small words which are commonly used. And actually Aske explains that really well. And we had a really great expert, Lita Lundqvist, who explains exactly how the Danes, they can communicate using these minor words that actually are equivalent to saying, "just joking."
While many Danish people can speak perfectly serviceable English, there are a lot of little Danish words, often adverbs, which we use all the time in our everyday language. Most of them are not easily applied or translated into English.
Like jo, mund, vist, vil, blot, etc.
And as it turns out, these words are super, super important when it comes to joking in Danish or understanding irony. Without the use of these words, we will not be on common ground if I make a joke in English, because my translation will naturally erase them from the sentence, and you will have a hard time knowing that I'm joking.
It's like this sort of the filter. It gets those little cues just get lost in that literal translation.
Yeah,
filter thing.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think Danish humor it's a difficult one, isn't it? And it depends. I mean, there are different levels of deadpan, and it's how ironic and sarcastic can you be in the public space and sphere when you're not with your friends and in your bubble, so to speak. That's a difficulty. So I actually find that maybe it's because I've spent 18 years abroad that I often say "just joking." And I probably wouldn't say that with my family and my close Danish friends. But maybe I've just learned that is a way of making sure that people are not offended by what I say, because I tend to have the same Danish humor, but I've just learned to say that.
Yeah, because I think because the world is such a diverse place and there are these different, there's not always this shared understanding. And I think we spoke about it in the humor episode where irony only works when you know that I know that I'm joking, or I know
exactly,
or whatever it is, you know that I'm joking. And if you're meeting somebody from a completely different culture, that assumption isn't there. So you do have to bridge it. And so if you're then taking the Danish set of assumptions of what is humorous and you're taking it to a Turkish context, that you're not singing from the same hymn sheet. You've got these different, there is this sort of different understanding going
There's
on.
a clash.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that was quite interesting that we discussed about Danish humor is this self-depreciation that we have. And that's, again, now coming back to janteloven, that it's all about talking yourself down as a joke, because that's, again, a way of as being level with others and creating a sense of campfire that we're all together. So you'd rather talk yourself down than celebrate something else. A ton of people have come up with fantastic ideas. They've sent them to us through social media channels. They've sent it to us through emails. They've called us. They've contacted us in so many ways. They have great ideas for episodes.
And I'm a bit of a spreadsheet guy.
We love it. We love it. It's all compiled in a safe space.
But I've had to graduate from a spreadsheet into more of a database to house all these different ideas we've got and categorize them. Because there is just so many peculiar things about Danish culture where you think, okay, we've kind of got everything covered. And someone says, oh, can you do an episode on nudity? And I'm like, what? And she says, yeah, so we had a message from someone.
It's so true. That's
like,
a good one.
My French boyfriend was outraged when he was walking on Amar Beach and just saw naked people jumping in the water. And I've definitely had this as well, where actually the example I had was I went to a museum, and they have these like little videos of like what life was like back in the 1500s, and there was just this like naked couple getting into a bath or something, and like you could see everything. And that's like
very uncomfortable. It's not the thing that you'd normally show.
It's like there are kids walking around, and like, you just see this completely naked couple, and. Yeah, so anyway, an episode, we'll be doing an episode on nudity. I'm sure.
I mean, it's so random what people they suggest, but it makes so much sense. It's great ideas, but for example, someone also mentioned to me, how about doing something about all the weird kinds of dairy you have in Denmark? Because when you go to the fridges in the supermarket, there are so many things to choose from, and you just don't know how to navigate it as a foreigner.
I got so stressed. My girlfriend was like, "Can you pick up some milk?" I was like, "Oh my God." I got this.
What is this?
It's like I like called her up. I was like, "Which one?" Because there's about 20.
And it's a bit the same with bread. We also have a lot of. I mean, we have a bakery culture, so we have so many different kinds of bread in Denmark, from rye bread to various kinds of white bread.
Yeah,
there's some really great suggestions, and I actually popped into your wonderful database this morning, preparing for this episode today, and. I saw that there was more than 155 ideas. Goodness me.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, yes.
We have a lot to catch up on, but it's exciting. Each and every one looks amazing.
So, I mean, yeah, we'll have to see what comes next when we do season 2.
We need sponsorship.
Yes.
We need someone to decide that we should do at least 150 episodes on this, and then we'll just go for it.
Exactly. And then we'll get going. Yeah, we'll be set off, and we can make them all, because it's so fun doing. We've got a great way for student journalists, people who want to be learning how to do it. They can come in, a bit like what Esker did with a humor episode. Come in, take ownership of a topic, go and research, for example, the topic of nudity in Denmark, or the different way of parenting. So I think and as you say, we find this interesting. I think that's sort of at its core. You and I and Andreas and everyone just likes coming together and talking about these things. And if we can then share it with people and sort of give people an understanding, that's fantastic.
And it makes a difference. I copied down a whole lot of different things people have said about the show. And Lawrence from Vestas, who's Canadian, said, "I wish such a podcast had existed when I moved to Denmark, as it would have made my integration easier and I would have felt less isolated." So obviously what we're doing does have an impact, and it makes people feel that they're not alone. And it might also explain some things that just makes it easier for them to integrate and have friends, get a job and all of that, which is nice.
Yeah. One thing I've had some feedback on is that even though it was a bit of a questionable joke, the joke I did in Danish humour.
Joke there about the scat.
About the
Oh,
scat.
yes.
But
We won't forget that one.
But apparently hearing a non-Dane trying to speak Danish is actually quite useful for non-Danes to sort of hear, because often if you interact just in English and you're like, okay, here's this impossible language, and I'm certainly not fluent, but I can have a bit of a conversation with, when I need to order a coffee and whatever, and just sort of knowing, oh, actually is possible to interact. And I certainly find when I am able to hold a conversation with a Danish person in Danish, people really light up and they're like, oh my gosh, we can actually like have a proper chat as opposed to an English chat.
It's exciting. We don't have a lot of people in Denmark who learn Danish as a foreign language. And so when someone has mastered it, it's amazing. I have a Romanian friend who has learned Danish, and she actually sounds Danish. And she actually lives in Sweden right now, and she also speaks Swedish. She's amazing, this woman. But it's incredible to hear her speak. You wouldn't know that she's not Danish. I mean, maybe sort of once every 10 minutes, there will be a word where you can hear a little bit of an accent. But it's remarkable for Danes to have that experience, because normally we are the ones speaking other people's languages.
Yeah. And I found, at least for me, if I'm chatting to somebody at the co-working space where I work, or having a business call with somebody Danish, and I can at least drop in a little bit, jeg forstår lidt dansk. Ja. Jeg kan snakke med min kærestes farmor, fordi hun taler ikke engelsk, or whatever. Then that's at least like, oh, okay, we're kind of a bit closer now. And then we go and we have the business meeting in English, but you've at least done a little bit to sort of, show that you're making the effort.
And it means you can tune in to conversations around you. So because a lot of the being together is actually about hearing what other people talk about, or hearing what's going on around you. And it can be very isolating if you don't understand what people are saying around you. And just knowing a bit of Danish, you'll already be able to tune in to people's conversations and know how to react in that space.
And I've got to say, when it comes to learning Danish, I mean, I'm not very good at languages, so
I think you're doing really well, by the way.
I'm doing all right, but like it doesn't come naturally. I've only ever learned, I've only learned English and I haven't learned it. I've just spoken it. But I really did find that spending a few months really dedicated to doing it, to sort of get up to that initial level, was really helpful, because there's only so much Duolingo and various other apps can sort of get you. If you're doing it like once a week, you don't necessarily have that critical mass of understanding. Whereas going to a school, learning a bit about the sentence structure, etc., just sort of gets you to a level where you can kind of go off out into the wild and formulate your own sentences or understand what's being said. So I certainly found that was good to sort of get up to that initial bump. And then after that, yeah.
And I think you actually have some really good advice for internationals in Denmark in some of our first episodes, where you actually say how to make sure that you get the exercise speaking Danish out and about. For example, by saying, excuse me, can we speak slowly? I'm learning Danish, so that people know immediately he wants to speak Danish, though he sounds like a foreigner. So I should not accommodate him by speaking English.
Yeah,
so
English, yeah.
I thought that was very useful, because otherwise the Danes, actually, we might not be so good at friendships, but we actually do really try to accommodate people. And we are very good at accommodating people by speaking English or trying to meet them through their language.
Yeah.
One thing is to foreigners trying to learn Danish, don't be discouraged when Danes say what the first time you say something, because all my friends, they say something once, and then I say, can you repeat that? Maybe in Danish or something, just what? And then they go like, they kind of like, they don't want to speak it anymore. But you just have to tune in to an accent.
That's really good, because that really does happen. And
it sounds rude, because in English you'd say pardon me or excuse me, whereas we'd be like, well, what? Again, a translation of Danish, which can seem very abrupt and sort of almost Viking like brute. So right now, Sam, we are planning a whole lot of future episodes, which is exciting because there is more than 150 ideas out there. And if people, they really want to find out when they're coming out, how can they do that?
Yeah, so the two things to do are on your podcast app, click subscribe. And that way, whenever we have a new episode in the future, that will automatically pop up on your app. So that'd be good. And whilst you're there, if you have been listening to any of the shows and you think they're good, a rating or review would be really welcome. As you can tell from this episode, we really enjoy reading them. And it's also helpful for other people who are browsing through podcasts to sort of get a feel for what the show's about. So if that tickles your fancy, then you can do that. And then the other thing is that we have a newsletter. So if you go on whatthedenmark.com, there's a little box there to put in your email address. And that's where we do a little update on what's going on behind the scenes with What the Denmark. We sort of explain a bit more about how the episodes were made, share some links. So if you subscribe to that, then you'll be in the know for when the episodes are coming out. And also when we have job opportunities for people to work on the show, that's how we'll be announcing them.
And you can find us on Facebook too.
We're on Facebook. I mean, basically, if you search anywhere for What the Denmark, I think we've managed to lock down all the handles. So I think that should be good.
We are easy to find, so just look us up.
But yeah, I mean, other than that, I mean, it's been great fun, hasn't it, doing these this first season?
It's been absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And the way that we've been received has been the most amazing thing. We really have had wonderful feedback. And the fact that these different shows have resonated with different people, and both Danes, internationals, non-Danes who live in Denmark,
People
non-Danes
abroad,
who don't live in Denmark. Wonderful.
Yeah. So I guess all to say is we'll see you in season 2.
Yes, we look forward to it.
Looking very much forward to it. Lots of great stuff to say. Andreas, any sort of parting thoughts?
Please connect with us. We're nice people.
Please connect with us. We're nice people. With a grin in the face.
with a smile on a smirk on his face. And that said, I also want to thank Hotel Mayfair, where we've been
Hotel Mayfair, they've been
show.
great, haven't they?
They've been absolutely fantastic. We're standing in this lovely hotel room that has accommodated us more or less from the start. And we have free sparkling water and a really, really lovely and homely space.
It's great. They've been so great.
And I'm just going to look. Hold on.
Yeah.
I think it's a double duvet.
Really?
I think it's a double duvet on the bed.
Oh my gosh.
I believe so. So anyways, you can get double duvets here if you wanted, but we did check out whether single duvets are available too, and they are.
Yes.
So come to Hotel Mayfair if you need to stay in Copenhagen at some point. It's nice here.
Yeah. Very good. All right. So now, this was what I practiced on one of the first episodes. Vi snakkes næste gang.
But I would like to stress the fact that I have probably brought in 5.7% of our listeners, because I can see 2.3% of listeners are from Canada. And 3.4 are from Australia.
Excellent.
Yes, but we actually also Canada. You know, Lawrence from Vestas, she actually is from Canada, and I know that she shared her views and link to it. So I think that there's your link and her link as well. It's interesting. The Canadians have been quite interested in this.
Just let me have.
Okay, okay. It's all okay. We'll cut that out.
Yeah.
We'll cut that out. Andreas has pulled in the Canadians. Sorry.
all the baristas in Canada.